Hi everyone, today's video is one that I've wanted to make for a really long time and then kind of kept putting off because I wasn't quite sure what books I wanted to include in this list. The idea behind this video is recommendations for people who don't read fantasy. So I've seen a lot of videos that are like beginner fantasy recommendations or recommendations for people that want to start reading fantasy. These are recommendations for people that do not want to start reading fantasy and who are probably not going to start reading fantasy. But if you are a fantasy fan and you have a person like this in your life and you want to kind of trick them into reading something that you also would like, this is a good list to start with. I'm really hoping actually that other people will like this idea and come up with their own lists and maybe do some videos about this because I have my own ideas about what might work for this kind of book, but I would really love to know what other people think. So let me know down in the comments as well if there are any books that you think would be good recommendations for non-fantasy readers who you want to sort of subvert and corrupt. And here's my list. And I also want to say before I start this video, this is kind of a joke. I honestly think people should read what they like. I think it's fine if you only read fantasy. I think it's fine if you never read fantasy. I don't really try that hard to get people in my life who don't read fantasy to read fantasy, although I sometimes do, but mostly I'm happy I have friends who love fantasy, and I'm happy I have friends that like other stuff as well. So this is really just for fun. Read what you want, read what you enjoy. That's all you really need to do. So this is just for fun. I'm going to go through and make the recommendations based on whatever kind of books that person might like to read and recommend a fantasy book or a couple of fantasy books that might work for them based on that. So first I want to talk about what I'm going to call gateway books. Books that are not necessarily fantasy or science fiction, but books that are kind of genre adjacent. Books that I think are aesthetically appealing to people that read fantasy. So these are books that might have a light or no supernatural element. First of all, I want to recommend The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This is the first book in a several book series. I liked it the most out of all of them. It is a very gothic novel set in mid-20th century Spain. It was written in Spanish and very successful and translated into English. I've heard some people complain about the translation, but I liked it, and I don't read Spanish, so, that's all I got. It involves a young boy who discovers a place called the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, and then encounters a mysterious, almost demonic figure who seems to be going around destroying all the books by a certain author, and that kind of leads him onto a mystery. Most of the books in this series, I think there are 4 of them, they kind of have elements that are verging on supernatural that maybe could get explained completely by things that could happen naturally or might have a supernatural element. So as a fantasy reader, this was a book that I really enjoyed and that really appealed to me, but if you are not a fantasy reader, I think this is also something that you might like. My next gateway recommendation is the works of Robin Sloan. His 2 books so far are Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore and Sourdough. I really enjoyed both of these books. I think Mr. Penumbra was my favorite, but I really enjoyed both of them. Again, both of these books have what I would call a genre aesthetic. They almost feel like they could be fantasy or are going to be fantasy, but they're also pretty grounded in the real world, and you could also read them completely as contemporary fiction. The supernatural elements are either just barely there or just barely not there, depending on which book. I would say Sourdough actually has a little bit more of the supernatural in it, but both are really enjoyable reads. I think both were very popular, and I think there's something that even a non-fantasy reader could really enjoy, but they're also something that a fantasy reader would enjoy. Okay, my last gateway recommendation is going to be The City and the City by China Miéville. This is actually the only book by China Miéville I've ever read because there seemed to be a little more horror elements in his more speculative stuff. But this is a book, again, that is just on the verge of being fantasy or speculative fiction without really quite clearly crossing that line. It's about 2 cities that exist within one in a very confusing way that I don't really want to spoil for you. And it also has very much a detective noir feel, but it's definitely something that feels like a fantasy novel without 100% going there. Okay, first let's talk about what to recommend to people who like historical fiction. My first recommendation in this category would be The Golem and the Genie by Helene Wecker. This is a novel that's set in New York around 1900. It's about 2 supernatural creatures, a golem and a genie, surprise, that end up in New York and are living undercover, basically, in different immigrant communities in New York, but it's really much more a book that's kind of about the life of those communities and what the time is like and how those characters integrate and survive and adapt. And it really isn't heavy on the supernatural elements, although they are an important part of the story. So I think somebody that's interested in that time period in general, or who's interested in historical fiction, would really enjoy this book, even if they don't generally read fantasy. Another book that you might be able to recommend to the historical fiction fan in your life is His Majesty's Dragon, or it's published as Temeraire in the UK. This is for people who might be fans of historical fiction, more like Master and Commander or the Hornblower series. I know that my dad really used to enjoy, when he was younger, reading these sort of naval military stories and other military fiction. So I think this is something that is really inspired by, especially Master and Commander, except in this case, instead of two human leads, you have a captain and his dragon. But other than that, it feels very historical. It has a very historical aesthetic. And I think in general, if you like reading those kinds of books, I think you would probably enjoy His Majesty's Dragon. It's also very fast-paced, very digestible, very easy to read, and the characters are quite likable. My last historical recommendation I'm a little less certain about, but I think I would recommend the Winternight trilogy by Catherine Arden, especially for somebody that is interested more in women's historical fiction. This is a story about a young woman that very much doesn't fit in with her world and her time, but it's explored in a very period-appropriate way. Of course, there are also elements drawn from Russian folklore, but it's also very heavily based on what we know of medieval Russian history, which I guess, honestly, to be fair, is maybe not a lot. So I think if that's a time period that interested someone, or if they were interested in stories like that, I think that they might enjoy the Winternight trilogy. It's also more of a slow-paced sort of character, maybe not even character-driven, but it's a very atmospheric, Russia-driven kind of story. So if that's something that appealed to someone, then they might really enjoy the Winternight trilogy. Okay, my next set of recommendations is for people who really like to read classics. First of all, I would definitely recommend Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This one was very popular. I think it came out in the 2000s, so it was very popular at the time. It is written in very much the style of a 19th century novel, and I think that Susanna Clarke really evokes that tone. The characters feel very authentic to their time as well. There are a ton of footnotes, and it really does feel very much like what a novel of that period that just happened to have magic in it would be like. So this is basically an alternate history in which there was magic, but everything else is pretty much the same in 19th century England. This is an interesting one because I think people who don't enjoy reading something that's in that more historical style would actually really not enjoy this book. Another book I would really recommend to people that enjoy classics would be Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. To me, I found so many parallels between Bancroft's writing style and things that I really remember from reading Dickens. There are these very colorful characters that show up briefly and then come back later. So especially the character writing feels a lot like Dickens to me, but also the style does feel very literary in this book. My only hesitation here is it's kind of a weird book where sometimes you don't quite know what's going on, so that might be a bit much for somebody who isn't used to reading that kind of thing, but otherwise I feel like the style of the writing and the style of the storytelling very much fits what somebody who loves Dickens would enjoy. My last recommendation for people who enjoy classics would probably be The Lord of the Rings. A lot of people who mostly read modern fantasy struggle with The Lord of the Rings because the style does not feel contemporary. It is just written in a style that is not what people use anymore, and for people that aren't used to that, it can feel very dense. But it is a beautiful trilogy, and it is still basically the foundation of all fantasy, so honestly, this might be a little bit of a weird one to recommend, but I feel like if you enjoy reading books in an older style and you don't enjoy contemporary works as much, then you might actually really enjoy Lord of the Rings. You might enjoy all of the poetry that Tolkien puts in. You might enjoy the style of the storytelling. Tolkien himself, he was a scholar of medieval or like Old English literature, right? So if you're interested in that sort of thing, then this might actually really speak to you. I don't know though, if you have a friend or family member who is dead set against fantasy, you might not be able to get them to read Lord of the Rings. But if you did, and they're a big classics fan, they might like it. Sort of adjacent to this, if you have somebody that loves mythology, particularly Greek mythology, I would definitely recommend that you try to get them to read the works of Madeline Miller. She has Circe and the Song of Achilles. I think both are some of the best Greek mythology retellings that I've read. I've also read a lot of not so good Greek mythology retellings, so I can't really recommend any of those, but I think maybe reading something like Circe could really appeal to somebody who isn't really interested in fantasy, but who likes Greek mythology. I don't know, are there people like that? I feel like I've loved mythology my whole life, and that's part of why I became such a big fantasy fan as a kid. But if there is somebody like that, maybe you can get them to read Song of Achilles or Circe. And let me know, there are some other Greek mythology retellings that are on my radar these days that I haven't gotten around to, so let me know if you have any favorites. My next category is people who like books that are funny. And for these people, I would suggest you try to give them Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. This is one of my all-time favorite books. I think even though it has strong fantasy elements, it also has a very mainstream appeal. I mean, the premise is that an angel and a demon team up to stop the apocalypse and find the Antichrist who has been misplaced. I feel like this is a premise that pretty much anyone can understand when you describe it to them, and it is just a hilarious book. I like Terry Pratchett. I don't know if I like Neil Gaiman really, but somehow the combination of these two writers just made an amazing book. I also love the miniseries. So if you have somebody that they're not really into the idea of reading fantasy because they really like books that are funny or light or humorous, definitely try to get them to read Good Omens. And if that works for them, maybe you can get them started on some Discworld. My last recommendation is for people who like romance. I don't know too many of these, but I'm pretty sure they're out there. So, one of my favorite series is actually The Parasol Protectorate by Gail Carriger. This is a series set in alternate history Victorian England as well. I think there were quite a few of those in this video, actually. So the premise here is that supernatural creatures like werewolves and vampires are actually, quite well known and accepted in society. They're actually mostly members of the nobility, and they coexist with regular people. Then you have a woman whose power is basically that she can turn supernatural creatures human by touching them, and you have a blustering Scottish werewolf, and there's a romance and adventure and stuff. And it's actually a really fun series. I haven't had to describe it in quite a while, so I don't know if that was the greatest synopsis, but I think for somebody that really enjoys romance and will they, won't they'd probably like this series a lot. I think it's actually a lot of fun. It's also very funny. And for my final recommendation, this one is going to be for people who don't like to read. Are there people like that? I don't know anyone like that. Sometimes I meet people that say they don't like to read, and I feel like that's kind of strange. And, I'm assuming if you watch this video, you probably like to read. But I would actually suggest that you try giving them Mistborn. This is probably going to be kind of controversial. It might not work for everyone, but I still think it's worth a shot because Brandon Sanderson's writing is incredibly digestible. It almost feels like you're not reading at all. So yeah, this might be a bit of a misfire if they really aren't interested in the fantasy elements, or if they just really don't like the idea of the magic systems or things like that. But honestly, I feel like even somebody that doesn't spend a lot of time reading or who just isn't really into reading in general could probably get through this book quite easily. It is a bit long, so that might be intimidating for some people, but I feel like the accessibility of the writing style, I've actually seen several people that don't read a lot be able to get through and enjoy this book. So those are my recommendations based on mostly personal experience and a little bit of speculation, and I am really curious to know what books you would recommend for somebody that doesn't like fantasy and who is not probably going to get into fantasy, but who you want to get to read a few things. So please let me know down in the comments what books you would suggest for some of these categories, or if you have a channel, please, I want to know what books you would recommend to people. So please make a video like this. I want to see it.